Yeah, send me a text. Otherwise, I'm definitely going to forget. All right, all right, all right. We are going to talk about appraisals as soon as I get this lined up. Oh, and I guess I should plug back in. Oh, all right. Hello, YouTubers. Sorry you had to hear all that nonsense. We are about ready to start here. We're ready to start here in the room. And today we're going to be talking about appraisals. And I call this class The Price is Right because appraisal is all about establishing value. So I've got a bunch of people here in the room with me, and we're going to dig right in. So, those of you who are in the room, what made you interested in learning more about this subject? What do you want to know? Terry. Okay, how to find out? Okay. Anybody else? Just learn about it. I understand. So I do want to be clear. This is a class about working with the appraiser and how they do their job. It is not really a class on CMAs, right? So what Terry was asking about is helping to establish the value of a home yourself. This is not that class. We do have that class, Terry. It's on the portal. It's called How to Do a Perfect CMA with Hans, who was just here. Okay. And I'm happy to coach you on it one-on-one and talk about establishing value and how I do it. But this class is really focused on what does an appraiser do? How do they establish the value? And what does that mean for us in the point of view of dealing with our buyers and sellers? Is that okay? All right. So here's what we're going to talk about specifically. We're going to talk about what is appraisal. What is it? A lot of people who get into this business, they don't even know what an appraisal is, and that's okay. I mean, it was touched on in real estate school, but you learn so much in real estate school that this might just fly by, right? Who is it for? Why are appraisals done? Who does it benefit and who does it not benefit? What is the appraisal contingency? Some of you have taken my class about contingencies in contracts, and one of them is the appraisal contingency. And we spend about 2 slides on it over there. We're going to spend a lot more time on it today. What is that contingency, and what are all your options around it as a buyer's agent or a listing agent? Protecting your buyer around appraisal issues. Yeah, could you close the door, Selena, because I can hear them really loudly. I've already got a loud voice, and I'm sure you don't want to compete. We don't want to compete. Oh, that's so much better. Protecting your buyer. Remember, you have a fiduciary duty to your buyer. So understanding the appraisal issues and how to protect your buyer is super important. Same with the seller. You have fiduciary obligation to them too. So does everyone know here what a fiduciary obligation is? What is it?
You required. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Once you have a client, it's what you give them exclusively, your expertise, your honesty,
No.
No.
That's good customer service. That's not fiduciary.
You take care of their interest before anyone.
There you go. Memorize that. Okay. This is something that buyers and sellers don't understand. They look at us like the clerk over at Walgreens across the street. They don't understand that we have a legal obligation to put their interest ahead of their own. Want to talk about building trust with a contact? Tell them that. Tell them I'm more like a lawyer or a doctor than the salesperson at the furniture store or the car dealership who has no obligation to look out for your best interests at all. You're completely on your own in those scenarios. But with a realtor, you have a partner, not a facilitator, a fiduciary, not a functionary. It's a really important concept, and you can use it in your scripts. Okay, and then we're going to talk lastly about appraisal bias, because just like all the other humans, appraisers can be biased. All right, and then hopefully there'll be time for questions. So what is an appraisal? It is simply a report issued about the value of the property by someone called an appraiser. Okay, this is not done by the seller or the seller's agent or by the bank lender or by you or your lender or your buyer's lender rather, or by your buyer. It's an independent third-party person called an appraiser. And they go out and they figure out what the property, what a value, they figure out a value for the property. And there's a whole blog. I have a series of links to blogs. So if you request at the end of the class, I'm going to give you a QR code to request the presentation slides. When you get the presentation slides, you'll be able to click on the blog links. But it takes you to one of my favorite bloggers called JVM, a whole article he wrote around everything you need to know about appraised value. It's great, great article. There are 3 ways, this you might remember from real estate school. There are 3 ways that appraisers figure out how much a property is worth. Number 1, they use something called the sales comparison approach. That is the main way they do it for residential. That's the main way. It is similar, but not the same as a CMA. Okay. The reason it's only similar and not the same is that appraisers are restricted by law what comparable properties they can use, and you aren't. Okay. So if you find a year-old comp that's perfect, you might bring that attention to the attention of the buyer or seller in your consultations because you feel it's relevant. You add in a factor of what's going on in the market now versus what was going on in the market then, and it provides value to you and your client. Appraisers are very limited in what comps they can use, and they may not be able to consider something that's outside certain parameters. And there are all these different parameters, not just age of the sale, but the size of the property and the amenities and the distance from the distance of the comp from where your property is that is being appraised. Another method they use is called the cost approach. And what they do in the cost approach is they say, how much would it cost to rebuild this property on this land? And they factor in the value of the land and they come up with a cost. That is a secondary number that is provided in all of the appraisal reports you will see for residential, almost all. The third approach is called the income approach. This is primarily for apartment buildings and shopping plazas where you've got, or industrial uses, anywhere where there's money being generated by rents or leases or by occupancy and other things. If there's an income being generated from the property, you can figure out the value of the property based on how much income is generated by it. We don't see this approach on residential homes very often at all. We just don't. They almost always use sales and cost, sales comparison and cost. When you look at an appraisal report, there is actually a line that says that they didn't use that one. And they tell you price, an estimate of value using the other 2. Another thing to remember about an appraisal is it's a snapshot at a point in time. It is a snapshot at a point in time. The older the appraisal, the less value it has. How old is too old? It depends. If the market is very hot and very dynamic and changing a lot, then a month-old appraisal could be out of date. If it's a very stable market, it could be good for 18 months. In my experience in the Bay, East Bay here, I wouldn't go with an appraisal more than 3 to 4 months old. It's too old. It's lost a lot of its meaning because our market is dynamic. But you have to judge it one-on-one. But just remember that it's a snapshot. It is not relevant the older it gets. It's less relevant the older it gets. And that's why it has a limited life.
Yeah.
Oops. Okay. Even though they use the sales comparison report and they have comparable properties in an appraisal, it's not a CMA. It is, the way you have to look at it is a professional estimate of value based on very specific criteria. And there's regulations, and appraisers have to stick within the laws of being a appraiser. They are restricted on what comps they can use, what counts as usable living space, and how they have to handle permitted versus unpermitted additions. So let's suppose that the listing on the MLS is a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, and you went and showed the property, and it's clearly 3 full bedrooms with a closet and everything. But you come to learn that the 3rd bedroom was a converted garage, and they did it without permits. The appraiser will consider that a 2-bedroom house with an open extra bonus space, and they will not appraise it as high. That's an example of this. And what's a CMA? it is a professional estimate by you of the value based on your review of comps and local expertise, which is sometimes far superior to what an appraiser can do. You may have spent hours and hours studying that property. You may have visited all the recent sales in the neighborhood. You may have done a great deal of knowledge about the neighborhood and the history of it. You may know about the new development going in down the street, blah, 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 blah. The appraiser is doing 10 of these a day and spends maybe 10, 15 minutes at the property, looks at the comps on, looks at the MLS briefly, maybe. Who's going to have the better data? So sometimes you're going to see the appraisal come in with different comps than you used, and you're going to wonder why they didn't use your comps. There's a blog post about how you talk to the appraiser about it here. And there's a blog post about some of the typical differences we see all the time between what the appraiser comes up and what the realtor comes up. Okay, both worth reading. The point to remember at the bottom line is that neither the appraisal nor the CMA is fair market value. The term FMV, fair market value, is something else. What is fair market value? Anyone want to give a guess? What is fair market value? Any guesses?
Ad valorem according to.
Well, ad valorem means, yes, that's the Latin, that's in tax, that's tax language. That's what the tax department thinks. That's not fair market value either. So you have what the tax people think they're going to do the property taxes on. You have the appraiser value. They have your CMA. You have what your buyer is willing to offer. You have what the seller listed it for. That's 4 or 5 values. How do we know what fair market value is legally? Any ideas?
People are paying.
You're on the right track. Fair market value is what a buyer is willing to pay and what a seller is willing to accept in an arm's length transaction, non-family, no special circumstances, right? So if Ricardo sells his home to Selena for 50,000 below market, that is fair market value for that property now. She's willing to pay it, he's willing to take it. That's all. Okay. Sometimes buyers will ignore the appraisal. They'll ignore your comps. Okay, they'll do it one of 2 ways. One most common way is they'll say, I don't care that everything is selling for 1.2 million. I only want to offer $1 million. If you were in the class the last hour, you heard that very story from one of the agents who was telling us about the buyer wanted a lowball an offer 800 on a property that only been on the market 8 days with 3 competing offers. That buyer's estimation of fair market value was clearly less than what other buyers thought, right? But it goes the other way too. You'll have buyers who see there are 10 offers and will offer a premium on the price that it is not supported by the comps. But the seller's certainly willing to take it, and the buyer sees the value there. So what we're going to do now is we're going to walk through an appraisal report. I know, right? We're going to walk through one because you guys are going to see them, and I want you to have some familiarity with them. This is also a clickable link when you get the PDF. All right, so this is page 1. Do you guys need me to make it bigger? Sorry, is that good enough? Okay, the most important pages in the appraisal are page 1 and 2. Okay, I do want you to read the whole thing. But from our professional expertise, you can usually learn most of what you need to know in the short term by reading pages 1 to 2. Okay, I'm going to walk you through all the pages. So at the top of page 1, it tells you the property address. It tells you how long it's been on the market. In this case, there's some data. Do you see where it says DOM 34? I'm going to try to move my mouse over it so you can see. My mouse keeps disappearing. See this? DOM 34, DOM days on market. This property's been on the market a month and 4 days. The list price was $340,000. It's in contract for $365,000 according to the MLS. It is an arm's length sale. There's the contract price, the date it went into contract. No special concessions are being noted. More information down in the neighborhood section and more information about the site and about the property. This is a standard form. It hasn't been changed in decades. It's clearly not very modern or pretty, but this is what they all look like. It tells you what appliances are included in the sale. This is gleaned from the MLS or from conversations with the seller, but usually the MLS. If the MLS is wrong, the appraisal will be wrong. So there's an opportunity there to make sure it's right for you, right? All right. Is there any significant physical deficiencies? Is it typical of the neighborhood? All these questions. That's page 1. Absolutely, you should review this to make sure there are no mistakes. Make sure it conforms with your understanding as the listing agent or the buyer's agent. Page 2 says there are 2 active, says properties currently offered for sale. I'm right at the very top. There are 2 properties on the market, priced from $210,000 to $415,000. This is 7 years ago. There are 7 comparable properties that have sold in the last 12 months, priced from $220,000 to $390,000. Okay. Then he's got the feature, then the subject, that is the property being appraised, and then comparable sale 1, 2, and 3. The sale price is the top line. So he's got one at 317, one at 349, one at 330. Already we've got a problem. We're in contract at 365. His first 3 comps are well underneath that. And then he goes into all the detail for each of them. And then he has adjustments, various adjustments in the that he's made. And then he ends up with an updated sale price after he does the adjustments, which is, where is the adjusted price? Sale price, value adjustments, but he has a total here. Here is the bottom line. Adjusted sale price of comparables at the bottom, 317, 340, 320. And he did make some adjustments. He didn't adjust comp 1. He brought comp 2 down 9,000, and he brought comp 3 down 10,000. So it's gotten worse. Okay, he said those are inferior properties to the subject property. So he has to reduce their value even more. That's how adjustments work. You can do these on a CMA, by the way, property by property by property. All right, so bottom line, indicated value by sales comparison approach, 320. Indicated value by cost approach, 340, 440. Income approach is 0 because he didn't use that method. So the very bottom of page 2, he's going to tell you the appraised value. This appraisal is for 320. How much are they in contract for? Keep that in mind. So page 3 is, there's an opportunity for notes, and he just has a C additional addendum, which is at the bottom. Then he talks about how he did the cost approach valuation. Then if there was an income approach, it would be next. Any other information if it's part of a condo. Then on page 4, he's got all his CYA, where he talks about, all the reasons what is and is not in this report, right? And things he will do and not do, right? That's all standard boilerplate language. He certifies that he's a legitimate appraiser. This goes on for 3 pages, and they sign at the bottom. They give you their licensing information, and they tell you the appraised value again on the bottom of page 6, appraised value 320. Then they have some definitions that they used on the previous pages. We're not going to get into this. It isn't necessary for today, but you certainly can read it and learn how they're all going to look the same for this part. Definitions, more definitions. Then he has 2 more comps that he gave lesser weight to with adjusted values of 334.9 and 344.9 because he reduced them as well. So this is all in all a terrible comp, terrible appraisal. All 5 of his comps are reduced in value according to him, and they were all lower to begin with. Almost all of them were lower to begin with, except for, no, all of them were. So then there's more blah, blah, and more. And then there's a section here about where he says he's a really good appraiser. 24 years experience, blah, blah, blah. Anything else he felt worthy of noting. Then he has pictures of the property. Then he has Then he has pictures of the comps where he had them. And then he's got a map with a little arrow showing where the property is. See the little pink, the little red at the top. And then he's got an aerial map if he has one. He didn't have one. And then he has what's been going on in the market. This is also helpful for him to justify why he came up with the 320, right? And then he signs that. Then he sends you his certificate and then his insurance. You guys will see all this stuff. And sometimes there's a floor map. This one has a floor map. That's it. Page 1 and 2, guys, is really important. Do you have a question? Okay. All right. So that's the appraisal report. Okay. Your buyer's lender should be calling you because they'll get it slightly before your client gets it. And if it comes in like this is going to come as maybe a big shock and disappointment to your buyer. And if you're a seller, you're not even going to learn about it unless the buyer shares it with you. It is not the property of the seller. However, if the buyer agent shares the appraiser with you and the deal falls out, so buyer's in contract and the buyer's agent has an appraisal issue like this, they share the appraisal with you as the listing agent, and then the deal doesn't work out and they cancel and you're back on market. Do you have to tell future buyers about this appraisal? Absolutely. Yes. They negotiate it out. Either they settle or they don't settle. Yeah. Sometimes the seller will do an appraisal before they go to market. They have to disclose that too, no matter what it ends up showing. Yes. It should be if they have one. But yeah. All right. So, yeah.
The 2 appraisal reports come out.
Again, everything is negotiable. The buyer may not be choosing their appraiser unless they're a cash buyer. If the buyer is getting financing, the lender chooses the appraiser. Yeah. But let's suppose the buyer comes in with a low appraisal and the seller has one to higher. The seller is not obligated. It depends. It depends what the terms of the contract were. We're going to get into that. But it doesn't matter how many appraisals are out there. Everything's negotiable. Okay, so let's keep going. Great questions, though. Okay. So first of all, you should know that for these appraisals, they are usually required by all lenders, whether the buyer is putting down 5% or 95%. It doesn't matter. The lender will need an appraisal to protect their interest. Your buyers will pay for the appraisal in most cases. There are a few lenders out there who throw it as a bone to get business. I'll pay for the appraisal. These appraisals are expensive. They're between $600 and $1,000 nowadays. More if you order at Rush, right? But there are lots of different ways that appraisals are done nowadays. It used to be when I started in this business. See, I have the gray hair to prove it. I've been around a while. The appraiser would always go on site, always go on site. Now that's not so true. There is a blog here about all the different ways the appraiser might evaluate the property, which includes automatic. The appraisal company pushes a button and gets a number. Or the underwriter says, we don't need an appraisal. We looked at the comps of recent sales and we're comfortable with the value at the sale price. The underwriter for the lender says, oh, we don't even need one. That happens too. But the point is, if you go into this blog, it'll tell you about all the different variants. Okay, it's good to know. Good to talk about with your lender. Okay. Bottom line is, what does this mean around the appraisal contingency that may or may not be a part of the contract? So for the point of view of this class, we're going to assume that there is an appraisal contingency, okay, with the offer. Okay, and all an appraisal contingency is an optional term in your RPA, in your residential purchase agreement, that gives the buyer the right to cancel the transaction if the appraisal is unsatisfactory to the lender. Now, notice my wording there. Unsatisfactory to the lender does not mean always the price is low. The lender may find the appraisal unsatisfactory because the condition of the property is below their underwriting standard. For example, some lenders will not lend on a fixer-upper. If the buyer wanted to do their own appraisal, or the lender did want an appraisal, the appraiser would say, well, you have to fix that water that's pooling in the living room, and you have to get rid of that stench out of the bathroom, and you have to repair the broken window in the cellar, and blah, 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 blah. This home is not livable. We cannot pass it on condition right now. In its current condition, it's worth X hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the lender still won't loan on it because it's depending, because it's uninhabitable. Uninhabitable. You can't live in it. And that is why investor buyers looking for fixers pay cash. That's why. They don't get regular conventional loans because they're uninhabitable. Yes. No. Nothing to do with FHA. FHA stands for Federal Housing Administration. That's a special 3.5% down loan. And it does have underwriting standards for appraisals. But what I'm talking about, and some of those might involve condition issues. Any appraisal can be rejected by the lender because of price or condition. It is a myth in the industry that FHA loans have a higher appraisal. Let me say this the right way. If a buyer has an FHA loan, it has underwriting standards that are different than for a conventional loan. There are a lot of variables that go into how a lender determines the appraisal risk. So FHA loans do have different standards, but in some cases they are not worse than conventional loans. In some cases they are, or worse is the wrong word. They're not more restrictive. In some cases they are. Okay, but I would never assume they always are. It depends on a lot of other variables, including how much down payment there is in total. Yes.
The tenancy. So it's like I was asking Eddie, he said sometimes those are difficult because lenders won't lend. It's hard to find a lender.
There are two issues here. One is a lender willing to do a loan, and one, how the appraised value impacts a loan. So the ability of a buyer with a TIC to get a lender who will finance that TIC is a whole other question outside the scope of today's class. If they do have a lender who's willing to do a TIC, there would be an appraisal. Okay, the appraisal is strictly about the condition, the value of the property as per this third party, whatever that property is, whether or not there is a lender involved. All I'm saying is normally if there's financing, you need a lender involved, which means you need an appraisal. But if you have a cash buyer on a TIC, they may not bother with an appraisal at all. Okay. If a lender is willing to finance a TIC, they're willing to have an appraisal done. Okay. So let's talk about how this works. Let's suppose the buyer writes the offer. It says X days. Let's say 10 days. Let's say the buyer has 10 days after offer acceptance. I put an X there because it's completely up to the buyer and their agent what they write. They could have the contract stipulates, what's the default in the contract? No. What's the contract language say without changing it? Anyone know? No. 17. Okay, they're all 17 except for one of them's 21 days. Anyway, we always change it to 10 days. Okay, or you can change it to 7 days, or you can change it to 5 or 3 days, or whatever number of days you and the lender think are appropriate and your buyer agrees to, because ultimately it's your buyer's choice. But they're going to defer to you and their lender. Lender says we need 14 days for the appraisal. That's what you put down. Okay? Let's just use 10 because it's an easy number to work with. They have 10 days after the offer is accepted to take action on the contingency, the buyers. What is offer acceptance?
Say it again.
What does it mean? Offer acceptance. Maybe, but I only have half of it. How do you know an offer is accepted? You're on the right track, Linda. If Linda's buyer wrote an offer and it gets accepted without any counter offer, how does Linda know? You represent the buyer. How do you know?
Seller accepts it and then the buyer has to then confirm.
No. Ricardo, what do you think?
they send it and it's in her mailbox, it's accepted.
As soon as they send it, they don't need to confirm it's in her mailbox. The email address that's on page 17 of the contract is where they're supposed to send it. So long as they send it and they have proof that they sent it to that email address, it's considered delivered and accepted, whether Linda opens the email or not. Okay. Now, the only problem with your answer, you had the right idea, is it is still an accepted offer if it works the other way. If the buyer is the last person, whoever is the last person sending the email creates acceptance. And how would it be the buyer? Let's suppose that seller in Linda's case said, hey, we like the offer, but we want 10,000 more. And they send a counter offer. Okay. So you still don't have acceptance. They send a counter offer. Linda looks at the counteroffer, her buyer signs it, and she emails back the signed counteroffer. That is ratification, acceptance or ratification. All right. Let's say that this happens. That's acceptance, either side. That was the only point I was trying to make. Could be either side that creates the acceptance. Whoever sends the email that seals the deal, right? Now, next question. By the way, that doesn't take you guys off the hook of checking your emails and communicating and, doing an extra handshake. Hey, got your acceptance or got your counter offer. My buyer has just sent you back the counter offer. Did you get it? Whatever it is, you always finish the communication loop, but you have acceptance at the first email. Now, the question then is, how do we count these 10 days? So let's suppose, hypothetically, that Terry gets into contact with her buyer on Friday of a long weekend. Okay. So first of all, we have 10 days. When is day one? How do we start counting these days?
Saturday.
Oh my God. Yeah, sure. Oh, interesting. All right, Ricardo's the only one who got it right. Day one is the next calendar day. Okay, do not ever forget this ever again. Next time I ask in a class, you should all know this. Day one is the next calendar day for any ratification of a residential resale sales contract. Always. It doesn't matter what days of the calendar follow for when day one is. Day one is always the next calendar day. As long as the next calendar day comes and we don't have an apocalypse, it's the next day. Now, if you ratify at 11:59 p.m., or you send that email and it's time-stamped to 11:59, or you send that email and it's time-stamped 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it's still the next day. If you timestamp at 12:01, it's the day after that. Sunday, yeah. So don't be going and ratifying at 12:01. Ratify at 11:59. Any questions about day one? Grill that in because your buyers need to know. It's important. You get into contract, you're going to be putting together a calendar, I hope, showing your buyers when the contingency is due. You got to know when to start counting. Okay, so we know day one. Everyone agrees it's the next calendar day. Now, when is day 10? Do we count the business days or all the calendar days to get to day 10? I scared you all. No one wants to say. Here's the way it works. A contingency or a closing or any contract condition or obligation may not end on a non-business day. May not end on a non-business day. By the way, initial deposits have a different role completely. So forget about initial deposits for a minute. I'm talking about contingencies. I'm talking about closing deadlines. They cannot end on a holiday. So let's suppose we ratify on Friday for 10. Let's make it simple. We ratify on Friday for 7 days. Okay, so Saturday is it's a 7 day. I'm changing it, 7 days. Saturday is day one, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I messed it up. 8 days. Yeah, we can still use 10 days. Sorry. I apologize. Sorry. 10 days. We ratify on Friday. Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. No, it doesn't work either. Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Okay. Day 10 is Monday. Let's suppose that Monday was a holiday. Okay. You can't have it end on Monday. It has to end on the first business day. So the ending of the contingency timeframe is what's really important here. You can't resolve any contingency or closing on a non-business day. Any contract obligation, okay, cannot end on a non-business day. Yes. Yes. So when you're doing your calendar for your buyer might get an extra day, 2 or 3 if there's a long weekend, which is great. Okay. All right. Now, at the end of the time period, whether it's 10 days, 5 days, 7 days, your buyer or the buyer, whoever the buyer is, has to take action. They have to do something. And if they don't, the seller has to force them to do something. But if they don't force them, if the seller does nothing to force the buyer, then the buyer has as long as it takes them. The contract is not over. Without penalty, I might add. So, what is the lesson here? If you are a buyer's agent, you absolutely want to do something by day 10 because you're a total professional and you don't want bad will, and you also need to protect your client's interests, which involves doing things when they've committed to do them, keeping that good faith. I mean, there's so many other reasons. If you're a seller, you better be in contact with that buyer's agent. Make sure, hey, in a nice way, I see that your contingency is coming up tomorrow. Is everything cool? So many listing agents don't bother with that, but they should. It is very good professional practice. What if what doesn't happen? We're going to talk about that. Okay. All right. Let's first talk about what could happen with our appraisal. So the appraisal comes in at the sale price or higher with no conditions. So what typically happens is everyone breathes a sigh of relief and the buyer waives the contingency and says, Mr. Seller, we're moving forward, and they send them a piece of paper and they sign off. We're lifting, we're waiving, we're removing the buyer appraisal contingency. Okay, that's very simple. Sometimes the appraisal is higher. You as a buyer's agent do not have to share that with the seller that they left money on the table, but you certainly want to brag about it with your buyer. Hey, Mr. Buyer, this appraised for $10,000 more than we actually in contract for. What a great deal I got you. Or you got for yourself. Yes.
Just before we move on to that, if it appraisal comes in and I don't like it, do I have a chance to ask my lender to ask for another one if I'm a buyer? Or
You're jumping ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
My goodness. But it's a great question. I'm going to deal with that. So the first scenario is everything is cool. Now, if your buyer went into the contract in good faith, he can't simply cancel the deal on an appraisal contingency if the appraisal came in, because that would be misrepresentation. He would need to have a contingency that allows him to cancel because he changes his mind, which is a whole different contingency. Okay, but he's keeping. Okay, he's moving forward. Now, the second is it comes in below. Either the sale price is low or with underwriting conditions about the property. That could be a big problem for the buyer. Okay, let's again remember in this scenario, there's a contingency with the offer of 10 days. So, what are his options? This is a summary. We're going to dig into the weeds on this. They can waive the contingency anyway. And they're basically saying, we'll pay for it, Mr. Seller. Don't worry about it. Okay. In fact, they never even tell the seller. We just waive it. It's there between them and their lender and the escrow to make sure the money's there. That happens. They can cancel the agreement. Mr. Seller, the property did not appraise. Bye-bye. Does the seller have to return their deposit? Absolutely. Absolutely. Does the buyer get the money back that they paid for the appraisal? No. The third option, they can request an amendment to the agreement. So the buyer and seller have a ratified contract, but either party can request a change in terms anytime until closing, right? So the buyer goes to the seller and says, hey, I want to change the sale price, or I want you to do repairs, or I want more time to think about it. Any of those are typical requests. We're going to dig into them, so I'm not going to go into detail about them right here. Okay? So the buyer has options. Okay. So let's talk about the money first, and then I'm going to get to Ricardo what the options are. So let's assume $1 million sale price with a 10% down, $100,000. We see this scenario a lot around here. Agreed? Okay. That means they're getting a loan of $900,000. Agreed? But the appraisal sadly comes in at $950,000. Ooh. 50,000 below. So what's the problem? The buyer's lender will only provide financing for 90% of the appraised value, not 90% of the sale price. So if the appraisal comes in low, the lender is offering less money. The loan is not imperiled. This is not a loan contingency. It's amount of money available with the financing. So 90% of 950, which is the appraised value, is actually 855. The buyer is putting in 100,000, which means 855 plus 100 is 955. The buyer is only $45,000 short. They're not $50,000 short. This is an important thing to consider when you're talking with your buyer about whether they should wait, whether they should cover it or not cover it. They need to understand it's not the amount of the difference. It's the amount of the total of their down payment and how much the lender will finance. Okay. All right. Now I want to walk through answering Ricardo's question. So the buyer, as I said, if they don't cancel and they don't waive right away, they're going to try to request an amendment to the agreement. So they might ask the seller, Mr. Seller, we'll buy your house if you lower your price to the appraised value. Because we don't want to pay more than what an appraiser says it's worth, because the appraiser is God and they know. Or you could say, Mr. Seller, we can move forward if you split it with us 50-50. There's all kinds of negotiation around that. We can script practice all day long. Okay. But that happens a lot. Okay. They could go to the seller and say, Mr. Seller, the appraiser says the price is okay, but there is a water leak underneath the kitchen sink, and we need it repaired for us to get our loan. Can you take care of that? Give us proof that it's been repaired. The appraiser is going to have to come back out, but then we're good. The seller may or may not agree to that. Okay. You could also go to the seller and say, Mr. Seller, the appraisal came in low. We need to take other steps to figure this out before we can lift our appraisal contingency. Can you give us a week? Okay. What can you do? So this gets to your question, Ricardo. You can work with the buyer's lender to reduce their down payment so they have more cash. So let's suppose this is a good buyer, well qualified. If they change their down payment from 10% to 5%, they now have the $45,000. They were putting in 100. So now they only put in 50 and they have the 45, and they have a higher monthly payment and maybe higher mortgage insurance, but that may be the best solution. Yes. But it may still be the best solution. Let's suppose they try all these other things and the seller says no, and they really want the house. This may be your backup option. Number 2, or B, 3B, they can dispute the appraisal with their lender. Now, this is a bit of a long shot because appraisers are proud and they work hard and they got this degree, and some of them don't like to go back and revisit their own work. And they're busy. They take some time. But you can go to the lender and say, we want to dispute this. There's a mechanism and a form, and you have to provide comps that you think should have been considered. That's why it's important to know what comps would never be considered. That's why I want you to read those blogs, because it tells you what kind of comps the appraisers never consider in disputes. A good lender partner with some experience will tell you that ain't going to fly. You could also get a brand new appraisal with the current lender or another lender and try again. I had this happen a year and a half ago. My buyer was in contract. The appraisal came in like 80,000 below. We switched lenders, got a brand new appraisal, and it came in at sale price. 2 different appraisals, $80,000 difference. And we closed 1 day late. So in the end, all we had to ask the seller for was an extension of the closing. We asked for a week. They gave us a week, but we only closed 1 day. Pretty cool, right?
So you need to change. Do you need to change lenders in order to do that, or you can just
To get a brand new appraisal? Yeah. If it's the same lender and same underwriter, they're going to only deal with disputes because the underwriter will going to reject the appraisal. Right. Good question, though. You don't do it often. I mean, this scenario only comes up. I mean, I've only had it come up one every 10 deals, and at different geographies, so it's not an issue. Okay. And the appraisers have a level of independence from the lender too. So might have a different appraiser just because of the fact there's a pool of you will have a different appraiser because the appraisers were independent. They're managed by a third-party company or they're solo, and the lenders pick them from randomly from a batch. There was all these laws changed about 10, 15 years ago to get some separation between lenders and appraisals, because you can see there could be a conflict of interest there. All right. Here's a good article about what I just talked about. What happens if your appraisal comes in low? You can read this article. Okay, so as a buyer's agent, I want to give you some best practice. First of all, review the comps and discuss the possibility of a low appraisal before you write the offer, so that they're prepped for it potentially coming in low if they want to offer high, or there's some danger that a reasonable offer might come in, might not appraise. Review all their options with them, not to determine whether they, not just to determine whether they should have this contingency in their offer, but also to verify they have enough money to close. Let's suppose the buyer says to you, it's really competitive, I don't only want an appraisal contingency. Then your job is, okay, if it appraises 100,000 below, do you have enough cash? If it appraises 200,000 below, do you have enough cash? You need to have those conversations, okay? Because they're at risk of losing their deposit if they don't have an appraisal contingency and the property doesn't appraise. And the lender is now saying, we can't do the loan because of the appraisal. Yes.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to go back. So if they have, if it was like, if they put less of a down payment and their loan amount went up, do they have to get a whole nother loan?
No. No.
The lender
No.
won't-
Yeah, as long as they're pre-approved. Yeah, so if they're pre-approved for $1 million with a 10% down, the lender will be able to tell you they're pre-approved with 5% down for $1 million or not. It may not be an option in all cases, but sometimes you have 20% down borrowers and they absolutely are sitting on $500,000 in reserves. It's no big deal. So you do want to talk to the lender about it, make sure it's on the table, but they don't usually need a new loan. They just need to recast the loan, but it normally doesn't have a full, complete underwriting again.
So in low, then
Possibly. Don't ignore that as a possibility. It's absolutely an option. Talk to the lender. Now, sometimes it's not an option. If you have an FHA buyer putting in 3.5% down and they've got $20,000 in the bank, they can't do anything like that, right? And they've got nothing. I mean, it depends. It all is contingent on the circumstances of your client. All right. So you review the buyer's options with them, talk about cash to close if the appraisal comes in low and they can't negotiate with the seller to get anything back or repairs. I would also consult with the buyer's lender, because your buyer may not be able to share with you as effectively as their lender can the same stuff about the options available to the buyer. So it's good for you to have that conversation with the buyer's lender. Always plan on attending the appraisal in person. Have any of you been to an appraisal yet? Okay. You will once you get into contract representing a buyer. And there's a whole blog post on how to talk about comps with the appraiser that you can reference from this slide. And then what we're talking about on this page is the contingency waiver. So there is the ability in the purchase agreement to have a partial appraisal waiver right off the top. So instead of saying we'll buy it if it doesn't appraise anyway, you could say to the seller, we'll buy it so long it is appraises over X dollars. So in our $1 million sale, you could put 900,000 in here and say, Mr. Seller, we need an appraisal contingency, but so long as it appraises over 900, and let's agree, Mr. Seller's agent, we can appraise over 900, it's a slam dunk, then we're basically an appraisal-free offer. You can put that protection in for your buyer, and I encourage you to try to every time. Okay. However, if you're doing FHA or VA financing, you need to check with the buyer's lender that that's kosher, because they don't like that on those types of loans. So check with them. Now you're a seller's agent. First of all, if the buyer's offer includes an appraisal contingency, you want to make sure your seller understands everything that could happen. Let's say we just talked about it before the offer is accepted, because you don't want surprises. You want your seller to be fully knowing, and we talked about that, you could even put them in an email if they want to, if they're slow to digest, or if they're being overwhelmed with other information, you could put it in an email. That's okay, right? You should attend the appraisal in person too. Most sellers agents don't, but you should. You're the seller. You absolutely want it to appraise. You want this deal to go through, right? You don't want to go back on the market, right? So you want to attend the appraisal in person and bring your own comps to make sure the appraisal is using the right comps, okay? If they can. No, not at all. Appraisals love it when you share your thoughts about the market. For example, you might say to the appraiser in person or on the phone, you might say, listen, that comp across the street that, I think everyone would use, just be mindful of our home was renovated and is completely new with the quartz countertops and the pool in the backyard. And it's also got that beautiful man cave downstairs. That place across the street, as you can see, is very dated because it may have closed. The appraiser can't get inside and the pictures may be poor. That place across the street, it sold at a low price because it didn't have all these things. That kind of conversation happens all the time. And you might want to have a backup plan with your seller's lender too, because some buyers and their buyers' lenders are not good. They don't have good lenders. They don't have good relationships with the agent and the lender, or the buyer with their own lender. So if you have a good lender partner, they could step in and provide an alternative around a new appraisal, possibly. So you want to have your seller just thinking about that too. If your seller has a lender partner, your seller may not. They may have lived in the property for 30 years and they don't have anybody. But maybe you do. Let's suppose you have a preferred lender partner that you love. You might go to them and say, hey, listen, I've got this deal. I'm a little worried. There's an appraisal contingency. Can you share with me what you could do to help out the buyer if they can't perform? Because you want to keep the deal together. All right. Let's talk lastly about appraisal bias in our last 5 minutes together. So appraisal bias. Everybody in this room and everybody in the world is subject to both overt and implicit bias. So, we really hide our overt bias and make it implicit. So very few people are going out there and saying, we don't like this type of people. It's just not, not as overt as it was 50 years ago. I think that's fair. But many people make judgments about people who look different than them or in any way, whatever the bias is. And sometimes they do it by accident. They don't have any mean to do it, but it's just the way they were raised and how they grew up and everything. So that's bias, right? And so appraisers have this problem too. And they might discount the value of the property because of what they see in the neighborhood and what they see when they go inside the house. Maybe there are family pictures that include religious identification. Maybe there is something about the family's, self-portrait that makes them make judgments. Okay. And we know this happens because they put out a report just 2 years ago that shows that 12.5% of appraisals in majority Black neighborhoods and over 15% in majority Latino neighborhoods came in below. But that only happened in 7.5% of white neighborhoods. Like, oh my God, right? Yeah, isn't it awful? So that is why there is a document in your purchase agreement called the Fair Appraisal Act Addendum. Has anyone seen this? When you're writing an offer, it comes up automatically and it says appraisers are subject to bias and you have certain rights around getting an appraisal that is not biased. So keep that in mind. When you're representing a seller, you want to encourage them to remove any identifying information that could promote bias. Pictures of the family or religious stuff, okay? If you are representing the buyer, you want to look out and see that is a fair appraisal. And there's complaint mechanisms and stuff like that. Okay. The last thing I want to say about this is there's 3 really great resources I wanted to share with you about appraisal bias and other biases. The first one is an amazing online class I took at KW last year called Unconscious Bias in Real Estate. And it shows it through exercises how we all are biased, even though we don't think we are. Really terrifying, right? The rose-colored glasses that we see the world through. And we make judgments even when we don't think we're making judgments. Great class. And then Color of Real Estate. That's a good overview class about the historical problems in our industry that pervade to this day with bias. And then this amazing but very depressing documentary from Newsday, which was done in, I think, 2022 or 23, where they sent secret shoppers into all these Long Island, New York realtor offices and they posed as buyers. And so you had a Hispanic couple and you had a Black couple and you had a white couple and anyway, and how they were treated differently and how they were steered and how they were not, the agent did not do their fiduciary duty. I mean, it was just awful. And so that's good for us to know about too, because we don't want to be those agents. You could lose your license actually for stuff like that.
Case where people purposely, they got an appraisal and then they went in and they changed all the pictures.
Mm-hmm. And then the next picture. Yeah. Yeah. And it got praised higher. And that's maybe what that study is that I just referred you to. Yeah, absolutely. It's a problem. Any questions? I can take one question because we're out of time.
Well, you can see pictures and everything, but if you see the name of the owners of the.
Yeah. You'll make judgments. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Whatever it is, could be anything. You're absolutely right. You're not going to eliminate bias just by removing the pictures. I didn't say it was a perfect answer. I'm just saying it's something that as a listing agent, you could do to help. But you're right. You're right. All right. So what I have here is a QR code. And with this QR code, you can get a copy of this presentation. You just have to answer a few simple questions. My assistant will send it out to you probably today, maybe Monday, but you'll have a copy of the presentation. And if you want to watch this presentation again, it is on my YouTube channel. If you don't currently subscribe to my YouTube channel, you can just send me a text and I'll send you the link to the YouTube channel. It's kind of hard to find just by doing a Google search because I don't have enough viewers yet. So it's kind of hard to find if you just try to look Stephen's coaching channel. It's kind of tricky. But if you send me a text, I will send you the link. And that's true for you folks well, for you folks who are watching this on YouTube, you should bookmark the page. Then you can find it easily. This is called The Price is Right. See how many classes I've done? Got a whole library now. Next week, I think we don't have a class next week, but the week after that, I think we're going to be talking about escrow management, how to manage an escrow.
From both sides, buyer and seller?
Yeah. But well, it's buyer centric, but I'll answer questions about sellers. Yeah, it's more buyer centric because let's be honest, when you get into escrow, the seller is merely like an auditor. Did the buyer do this? Because the buyer has way more performance obligations. The seller has usually done all their performance obligations up front. So it's like disclosures, right? So anyway, I'm going to take this down. Did everyone get it?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone.